All right, you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. Not that one, but this one. And I want to get straight into this story. And this story right here has a lot of moving parts to it. So without further ado, I'm just going to jump straight into it. So like I said, this story is about another longtime member who found himself in the crosshairs, yet he failed to take heed of the impending threat and all the warning signs that he himself knew were imminent. So Samuel Villalba Negro from Artesia was once a prestigious, highly respected senior member of the Mexican Mafia who at one time had amassed a lot of influence. He's another one of those members that you don't hear a lot about, but yet he's ripe with a lot of Mexican Mafia history. Negro comes from the 80s era and evolved with other Mexican Mafia heavyweights such as Abraham Peters, Topo from El Hoyo Maravilla, Joe Morgan, Cocolismo or Blue from Ford Maravilla, Adolf Reynoso, Champ from Big Hazard, Daniel Barella, Black Dan from White Fence, Frank Madrigal, Chino from San Diego, and Jimmy Soto, Rube from Venice. And these were just to name a few. The 70s and 80s were still considered to be like breakout years for the Nuestra Familia, for the Mexican Mafia, the Aryan Brotherhood, and the Black Guerrilla family. These groups had all evolved several years earlier, but the 70s and 80s, and even some of the early 90s were some of the most tumultuous and violent years in their history. Negro originated from Artesia, California, and at one time was close friends with Rene Enriquez, boxer from Artesia. In fact, Negro and Boxer's history go far beyond their street gang Artesia. They actually went through some of their initial Mexican Mafia beginnings and shared a lot of history behind the walls in the 80s. Some of the initial bloodletting in the 80s started with the conflict that erupted with the Africanos in Folsom State Prison. And the administration responded by putting all the perpetrators in the shoe and removing everyone that was involved off of the main lines. MA leader Joe Morgan was strictly against any peace treaty and refused to negotiate with the Africanos. But he was subsequently transferred out not long after this conflict started. Nick Velasquez, Nico from La Puente, then stepped up and acted as a representative for the Mexican Mafia. Under his own accord and driven by his faith in Christianity, and despite Morgan's position against any peace treaties, Nico brokered a truce with the Africanos. But this ended up resulting in all the Africanos and all the Mexican Mafia members that were involved in the conflict to be released back out to the main lines. And you know, despite some pushback, there were a lot of Mexican Mafia members that felt like Nico had did something that benefited the organization, that this benefited their position. But these views weren't shared by everyone, and it wasn't a collective decision. Some actually felt like Nico undermined Morgan's authority, and they were strongly opposed to peace. Long story short, a campaign to take Nico out for his transgressions was quickly assembled, and the wheels started turning. Spurned by dirty politics and his blatant dislike for MA leader Mike Eisen, Acha from San Francisco, Raimundo Alvarez, Vito from Rimas, makes an insidious attempt at a power grab. And his sole purpose was simple: to cause confusion, deception, and internal dissension. And here's the thing about Vito. When this incident took place, he was considered to be a highly respected, highly placed senior member of the Mexican Mafia. Also known to be a highly charismatic, manipulative, self-serving leader, Vito wove an intricate web of dirty politics that was all predicated on a personal agenda. Also known for his sharp-witted political moxie, he also managed to convince then-leader Ernest Roybal, Kilroy from White Fence, to go along with his unscrupulous plot. So because these two heavyweights were marching to the beat of the same drum, they became known as the Vito Kilroy faction. You know, in one of my past stories, I believe it was a story about Donald Ortiz, little man from Whittier. I think in that same story, I mentioned what happened to Vito. So anyways, Vito and Kilroy, they end up linking up and they turn their aggressions on other Mexican Mafia members. So one of the first things that they did, and this was more about seeing an opportunity to score points with Joe Morgan, was to make a strong push against Nico. They wanted to hit Nico for making that peace treaty with the Africanos. However, along with Negro, Boxer, Raymond Shrayak, Güero Shai from Artesia, Raymond Garduno, Güero Squire, and two other Mexican Mafia members, Corwin Elmore, Sloppy, and Gilbert Sanesteven, Gil from Hayward. All these individuals banded together for the same purpose: Believing that this was an unsanctioned hit against a fellow brother, they all decided to take a stand with Nico and defend his honor. So the next day, they all go out to the yard together with knives, and they tell Vito and Kilroy, "You're not gonna nobody. Nothing better happened to Nico. He hasn't broken any rules." And surprisingly, Vito and Kilroy, they let it go. They brushed it under the rug and decided to give Nico a pass. But this only bought Nico some borrowed time. You know what's crazy is that even though these guys saved Nico's life, later on, he would turn on all of them and he would actually start supporting Vito and Kilroy. He turned on them, the same brothers that were plotting on sending him to Brazil 2 months earlier. But in a convoluted twist of Mexican mafia politics, Gabriel Huerta, Sleepy from Wilmas, was then given the assignment to take Nico out. And he did it with precision. So while they were cellies, he created some type of ruse in the cell, preyed on the element of surprise, and ended up taking Nico out with a one-hitter quitter. It was said that he stabbed him once in the chest, turned the knife, and then thrust it upwards towards his heart. And at the time that this incident happened, Nico was actually drawing a lot of criticism because of his newfound interest in Christianity. He began to identify himself as a Christian. However, because of this, he would no longer preach his newfound religious beliefs to other members of the Mexican mafia. And the fact that Sleepy sent him to Brazil with one single blow earned him the nickname The Professional. You know, the cool part about this is that even though Nico switched up and betrayed all the brothers that came to his aid, the hit perpetrated by Sleepy was nonetheless ordered by Vito. But Vito and Kilroy, they weren't done creating chaos and dissension. They were just getting started. They seen another easy opportunity to push their deceptive agenda, and they pounced on it. So the second defining incident that solidified Boxer and Negro's close friendship took place in 1985 in Folsom State Prison. What started out as a campaign against the late Alfie Sosa from Happy Valley ended up turning into a fast-track death sentence for Alejandro Ferro, Little Mo from El Hoyo Maravilla. So Alfie, known for his propensity to instigate fights and start trouble, ended up bumping heads with Little Mo. This then led to a bloody altercation. And of course, he didn't stand a chance against Little Mo. Alfie was beaten badly, and this became a big embarrassment for him. As a result, Little Mo ended up giving Alfie the raccoon syndrome, or 2 black eyes and a broken nose. And as a direct result of this incident, Alfie was allegedly accused of committing an act of cowardice. And I'm not going to get into the details because I couldn't gather enough about the specifics, but let's just say this has been something that's been put out before by others who have talked about Alfie. You know, Alfie was getting a bad look at that time. Even Black Dan and Weddle Shy had planned on hitting Alfie, but they ended up giving him a pass. Originally, even Vito and Kilroy were planning on hitting Alfie, but seeing an opportunity to fry a bigger fish, they also opted to give Alfie a pass, and they administered a death sentence to Little Mo. Unfortunately for Little Mo, he wasn't popular with either Kilroy or Vito, and they considered him to be a threat. Not only that, but he'd also put his hands on another brother without sanction, and that was a cardinal rule that Little Mo had broken. Or in Mexican Mafia parlance, he committed an act that warranted a death sentence. So on November 15th, 1985, at Folsom State Prison in 3 Block, Little Mo was butchered in his cell. The Mexican Mafia members that were given the assignment were Danny Pena, Danny Boy from Big Hazard, Angel Valencia, Stump, and Ruben Hernandez, Thupi from Ontario. So while Little Mo was in his cell caught completely off guard, Danny Boy grabbed him in a headlock while Stump ran in and escalated the attack by stabbing him. Thupi, on the other hand, was told to hold the door closed. Little Mo never said a word or made a squeak during the entire attack. He did, however, make a fierce attempt at fighting back, taking blow after blow. When they were done, they had literally turned Little Mo into a human pincushion. They stabbed him dozens of times. Stump basically continued to stab him until he couldn't swing the weapon anymore. He was that tired. Him and Danny Boy were both physically spent. But at that time, it was obvious that Little Mo was already dying. And in a final act of integrity, Little Mo looked at both of them and said, "I'm dying. You did your job. Now leave before you end up getting caught." And later, driven by that same pride, Little Mo walked out of his cell, refused help from medical staff, and laid down on the gurney under his own volition. Soon after, he was taken to an outside hospital and subsequently slipped into a coma. So 12 weeks later, he woke up, ripped out the IVs and the feeding tubes, and he said, if I can't be a carnal, that's it. I don't want to live. I want to die. And that's exactly what happened. He ended up dying. And what happened to Little Mo put fear in a lot of the younger Mexican mafia members at that time because of the way that the rules were applied arbitrarily. You know, it wasn't just the fact that Little Mo had suffered the ultimate consequences, but it was also the fact that Alfie had escaped his punishment as well. This deadly game of cutthroat politics was aired out for everyone to see. And some of those that were involved were considered to be Mexican mafia titans, the pioneers and architects of that era. So the last incident that took place there was when Negro was given directives to hit a Mexican national or a paisa named Veracruz. These two end up getting into some type of heated argument, and the paisa, he throws a cup of water in Alfie's face. Long story short, Negro ended up stabbing this paisa like he was supposed to, but due to the fact that he failed to take him out, drew sharp criticism from Vito. However, Negro, he ended up stabbing this paisa with a huge foot-long, inch-and-a-half wide steel shank, a serious bone crusher that was fashioned from a slab of lacquer. Negro stabbed this guy so many times that he definitely thought he was a done deal. But this paisa wasn't no dummy. He knew that this was an unavoidable consequence that was coming because he knew how the MA operated. So in anticipation, he taped magazines around his midsection to protect himself from getting stabbed. But regardless to why or how this paisa survived, Vito started telling everyone that Negro was a half-hearted coward for failing to take this guy out. The fact that Negro didn't stay on this guy until he was completely immobilized was frowned upon by Vito, and only Vito. Back in those days, a lot of the hardliners considered a hit to be a failure if the target survived, and that still stands true to this day. But for Vito, this was more about a personal attack on Negro's integrity than anything else. He wanted to taint his image and lead others to believe that Negro didn't possess the heart of a real pistolero. That's what this was really all about. And everyone knew this because despite Vito's position, a lot of brothers gave Negro their unwavering support. Nobody bought into the idea of him being a coward. He stepped up and he whacked the paisa like he was supposed to, and that's all that mattered. Besides that, Negro had proven his mettle on several other occasions before in the past. This one incident didn't define Negro's entire resume, and anyone who thought it did wasn't being practical. Sound familiar? Sometimes you get sometimes you don't. It's as simple as that. As long as your objective is always to send your target to Brazil, that's all that matters. So Negro, he ends up getting transferred out before Vito had a chance to push a campaign against him. Vito, on the other hand, would continue to politic against other Mexican mafia members before his luck would end up running out and he would end up getting the green light put on him himself. He was actually even bold enough to politic against MA leader Joe Morgan. In fact, Joe Morgan and Acha, both considered to be legends at that time, along with stalwarts Weddle Shy and Fernando Bermudez, Fernie from Dogpatch, were all strongly opposed against the Vito and Kilroy faction. He would later see the writing on the wall and lock it up before Boxer, Thupi, and Vivesi Segato, Vessi from 18th Street, could get him. So this was just some of the adversity that Negro and some of the other Mexican mafia members from the 80s experienced, or during the so-called honeymoon phase of their commitments. But this would only make them stronger and would inevitably shape them into who they are today. Some of them are still thriving, while others have fallen out of good graces behind nefarious politics or their own shortcomings. You know, during Negro's beginnings, he was one of those types of guys that everyone liked. It wasn't too often that somebody didn't like him based on his own merits or because of the way he carried himself. Even those that were credited with sponsoring him and bringing him into the fold wanted to see him make it and put him on the fast track for membership. But Negro's biggest downfall and his biggest enemy was himself. Like a lot of us that come from dysfunctional families and who are introduced to drugs at a very young age, Negro started using carga when he was a kid, and he continued to struggle with his addiction for the remainder of his life. You know, it didn't help that he was involved with a criminal organization that allowed its members to openly indulge either. But still, Negro, he couldn't shake the dope fiend mentality and the desperation that comes along with being a full-blown junkie. And in the end, it was his addiction that set the stage and caused him to turn a blind eye to the impending danger that he should have seen a mile away. Throughout the years, I'm sure Negro experienced how intoxicating it was to literally have life and death in the power of your hands at his disposal. In prison, he was Negro from Artesia, a highly respected Mexican mafia member that most Sureños probably referred to as one of the big homies. If he gave a verbal directive, it was acknowledged without debate and usually would be carried out with a strong sense of nobility. I've never heard Negro to be one of those types of individuals that had a big ego, but I'm sure any Mexican mafia member, any NF member, AB member, or BGF member would admit that it's very intoxicating to have the power of life and death at their hands. Like most Mexican mafia members that are in good graces, prison was Negro's playground. This was where his influence and his power was at its rawest. And although the streets afforded him with that same power, this is where most members of these criminal organizations are more susceptible to getting caught up and in trouble. There's just so many more vices and depravity out there that for some, it's synonymous to walking through a minefield. Danger and failure are literally at every forward step. So now that I walked you through a little bit of Negro's history, fast forward up until the time when he paroled from federal prison. He gets inducted in the Mexican Mafia in the 80s, and then he's released from prison and paroles to Southeast LA. It was around this same time that several senior ranking members who were all on the streets began making a strong push to bring all the street gangs under the same tax umbrella. This infusion of progressive Mexican Mafia shot callers, dubbed by some as the Young Turks, became instrumental in effecting tighter control over street gang members both inside and outside the California prison system. And although many of these members were a lot younger than the more established old school Confederates, there was a mixture of both old and new in this group. Some of these new wave shot callers were Alex Aguirre, Pee-wee from the Avenues, Daniel Barella, Black Dan from White Fence, Ernest Castro, Chuco from V&E, Rene Enriquez, Boxer from Artesia, Arthur Guzman, Artie from King Cobras, Ruben Hernandez, Thupi from Ontario, Mariano Martinez, Chuy from V&E, and Raymond Shraya, Weddle Shy from Artesia. Some would even say that without the endorsements of some of the older members, such as Black Dan and Weddle Shy, that these younger members probably would have floundered and might not have gotten the respect from both the state and federal factions. Either way, another ranking member that would get out in 1987 was Peter Ojeda, Sana, who implemented the Orange County concept and would become known to be one of the real pioneers for the MS tax initiatives. This concept served as a template for replication on a much grander scale and therefore ushered in a path for the Mexican Mafia that would lead to permanent entrenchment across Southern California. This is also when the no drive-by edicts were put into effect and the concept of collective unity began to resonate. And then still later, you had others like Puppet from 18th Street, Bat from San Diego, Popeye from Logan Heights, Weddle Sherm from Shelltown, Popeye from Harpies, Sleepy from Wimas, Weddle Caballo from 18th Street, just to name a few, who also became instrumental in the street and taxing guidelines. So although Negro's not considered to be amongst the names of those most notable for orchestrating these changes, he was involved and was behind the scenes putting in work with those that were. He was summoned to some of the meetings in the parks, at the community centers, in fellow members' backyards. Wherever the gospel was being preached, Negro was there. But here's where Negro's problems started. Some of Negro's problems actually started in Artesia, his own neighborhood, with the sons of founding member Luis Flores, or Weddle Buff from Hawaiian Gardens. Weddle Buff's sons actually wanted to take Negro out because they felt like he disrespected them. And his sons, they felt like they were beyond reproach and that they didn't have to listen to Negro and other ranking members because of who their dad was. And that's why the conflict started, because Negro apparently gave them some directives and they refused to listen to him. And of course, this sense of entitlement was developed based on the fact that their dad was the founding member. If you guys remember the Mexican Mafia tapes that Chuco from V&E helped the FBI record in that hotel room, Negro was even in those meetings. During one of these recorded videos, Weddle Shy, he even brought this up. he acknowledged that Weddle Buff's family felt like they were beyond reproach based on the fact that their father was a founding member. However, he also emphasized that nobody was above the law. Weddle Shy, he even said that he talked to these youngsters and that he told them that they were going to respect Negro and they were going to listen to him and they were also going to fall in line, period. Furthermore, he also told them that they weren't going to put their hands on Negro and that if they did, it was going to be a serious mistake. And that if they didn't comply, he was going to be the first one to come back and do something to him. And in that same video, for those of you that watched that video and remember it, Weddle Shy then turned to Negro about a separate incident and confronted him about whether or not he sent someone to whack another Mexican Mafia member. And then he told Negro that if it was true, it was an automatic death sentence. Negro denied it, and Weddle Shy said he believed him. And at that point, they moved on to something else. However, later that year, both of them ended up getting indicted in the first racketeering indictment brought against the Mexican Mafia. And then for those of you that followed that story, you remember what happened. When the feds dropped the hammer and they started kicking in doors, Negro, he hit the burners and he ran to Arizona. I believe they even sent someone to his wife's house one time to infiltrate and to try to get a line on him. And then not long after that, they caught up with Negro at a Buena Park motel slipping. Federal prosecutors ended up indicting him for partaking in several votes in one of those videos. I think Negro, Weddle Shy, and some of the other members had all voted in favor of taking out Conrad Garcia, Big D, Charles Manriquez, Charlie Brown, and Donald Ortiz, Little Man. Big D and Charlie Brown were both targeted for acting as informal advisors for the 1992 movie American Me. I don't even think it was due to them acting as informal advisors. It was more about the distasteful portrayal of one of their founding members being sodomized, Cheyenne Cadena. And then of course, for those of you that seen the story that I put out on Little Man, he was taken out for the vague offense of disrespecting the Mexican Mafia. So Big D, he ended up dying of natural causes in 2012. And in that same story I put out about Little Man, I told you guys about how Charlie Brown was gunned down in the Ramona Gardens. So Negro, he ends up getting caught up in this sting and he gets sentenced to 16 years in federal prison. And up until around 2006, Negro was in federal prison doing his time and he pretty much has stayed off the radar at that point. However, the FBI and the DEA, they're always listening, especially when it gets too quiet. They're always keeping tabs of what's going on. And in 2006, the DEA tapped several Hawaiian Gardens gang members' phones that it maintained an interest in. And it was during the time when one of these calls was being recorded and monitored that two of their targets were complaining that Negro's wife was asking for money. This obviously put him back under DEA scrutiny and put him back on the radar. And because Negro's release date was getting close, they probably just figured that this guy is getting ready to be a part of the street activities. And that's why they're asking for money. But all that changed about 10 months later. While Negro was doing his 16 years in federal prison, he still continued to feed his addiction and dabble with black. Like in the state system, carga in the federal system remains one of the Mexican Mafia's most lucrative avenues for generating money. And it comes in the same way, either through rogue officers who are trying to make a quick buck, bringing it in, either through family, friends, or significant others bringing it in during contact visits, or through other clandestine methods of concealment orchestrated by some of the more sophisticated inmates. Where there's a will, there's a way. But it still remains one of the main ways that large amounts are getting in. But aside from it remaining a lucrative way for the Mexican Mafia and some of these other criminal organizations to generate money, a lot of these guys also bring it in for their own personal indulgence as well. I'm not sure what USP it took place at, but I believe it was at USP Victorville. At any rate, Negro was with one of the Mexican Mafia's commissioners, Jimmy Soto, Rube from Venice, when they got into some type of verbal disagreement. And this disagreement was over clavo. And whether it was clavo that was supposed to be given to him on consignment, or whether it was to be allocated to him in some other type of way, or squaring up a debt. Bottom line, Negro didn't get it, and he was highly upset about it. As a result, him and Rube, who was a commissioner at that time, end up getting in each other's faces and the argument escalates. Keep in mind, at the time, Rube was in his 80s, and I doubt he was looking for a physical altercation. I couldn't do it at 55. I know damn well he couldn't do it at 80. But he was still a leader, and even at 80, Rube wasn't about to let somebody get in his face and disrespect him. Negro, on the other hand, had already made the foolish mistake of getting in the commissioner's face and threatening him. Just that alone is the basis for serious repercussions. But Negro, he took it a step further. At that point, obviously fueled by his own addiction and pissed off that he wasn't about to get this clavo, his better judgment was nowhere in this, and he made the irreparable mistake of socking Rube in the jaw. So Negro, he punches an 80-year-old Rube and ends up knocking him to the ground. And it was at that point that Negro basically became a walking dead man, and there was nothing that he could do to fix it. Maybe he thought Rube would chalk it up as just a personal issue between them two, or maybe he thought no one would push the issue against him. But either way, he continued to program and acted like it never even happened. But not long after this incident happened, the feds, they were still listening to phone calls, and they knew Negro was in trouble. One of the inmates at USP Victorville was overheard in a phone call saying that Negro had been skating on thin ice for a long time and that he basically couldn't fix his problems. So a lot of times when they intercept a call like that, they'll usually go to that individual and they'll tell him, hey, look, you're in trouble. What do you want to do? You want to stay out here? You want to lock it up? But we got credible information, that leads us to believe that you're in trouble. I don't know if they did that or not, but Negro, he still stayed out there on the main line and continued to act like that incident never happened. Meanwhile, while he was still at USP Victorville, Weddle Sherm from Shelltown was given the directive to take Negro out. And this was obviously attributed to him putting his hands on one of the Mexican Mafia's highly respected commissioners. As far as Weddle Sherm, in the midst of his own dilemmas and looking for any opportunity he could to redeem himself, Weddle Sherm answers the call and attempts to strangle Negro. And Weddle Sherm, he makes an honest attempt at taking Negro's life, but in the end, he ended up failing. So according to one of my sources, Weddle Sherm used a braided piece of nylon to wrap around Negro's neck in the form of a garrote. It's basically a ligature and a favorite weapon that the ABs were known to use in Pelican Bay to take out their cellies. And when they're constructed right, they're actually deadly weapons because they become embedded in the skin during constriction and they're nearly impossible to grab a hold of. But supposedly, Weddle Sherm's version snapped as he pulled it tight around Negro's neck in an effort to strangle him. What makes this even worse is that Weddle Sherm had the assistance of several other sureños, including an individual that was later recruited into the MA by the name of Juan Gil Nito from Southeast LA. So that was the first failed attempt to take Negro out. At that point, Negro definitely should have seen the writing on the wall and either checked out or got off first every chance he got thereafter. But that's not what he did. Instead, he ends up getting transferred to another USP in Ohio, and he attempts to program again like it was all good. I want to say it was USP Elkton, but don't quote me on that. And once again, he's also hit here as the Mexican Mafia declared him open season, meaning that any sureño that ever sees him has a green light to go ahead and move on him. So from Ohio, he's then transferred to Florida to USP Coleman, where he's then stabbed again. By now, it's got to be obvious to Negro that he's been green lighted for his transgressions, but yet to his credit, he refuses to lock it up. Maybe he was somehow thinking that this would later work to his advantage and that he would be given a pass, but that obviously didn't happen. So Negro, he ends up paroling from federal prison with a huge target on his back. By 2021, he's homeless, he was living on the streets, and he had become severely addicted. His once chiseled up body from years of working out and staying in shape had been reduced to scabs, abscesses, and concave muscles due to years of skin popping and infections. Supposedly, he had been skin popping in his hips so bad that he had abscesses and open wounds all over his hips. And when they had found him, he had packed some of these abscesses with toilet paper and masking tape as makeshift bandages. Meanwhile, as he continued to run the streets with a severe addiction to carga, The looming threat of the MA obviously stopped weighing on him. Either that or he stopped taking it serious. At some point, he begins living in a homeless encampment near the 91 freeway in northern Long Beach. He was suffering from psoriasis, he had open sores all over his body, and he had lost a lot of weight. At first, Negro, he started showing up at this homeless encampment whenever he needed a place to fix or a place to get well. He'd pop into one of the many tents that was occupied by people that he knew from the streets, and then he'd share a taste of his fix so that he could use their spot to get well. These kind of places are called shooting galleries. The person whose spot it was would usually be okay with a wet cotton or 5 or 10 cc's of your stuff. After getting to know some of the other people out there and after popping in so many times, he eventually embraces this encampment as his own home. And one day he ends up putting up his own tent that he constructed from a piece of tarp, cardboard boxes, and scrap wood that he was able to find. Undoubtedly, this is probably when it dawned on Negro during one of those drug-induced sleepless nights that he had finally hit a hard bottom. And for once in his life, he was alone. All alone. Through all the trials and tribulations, through all the stark adversities that he had ever been through, and even during the few times when he stared death right in the eyes and butted right up against that door, that he was all alone. Negro, he was finally free from prison. And he was no longer incarcerated from the concrete walls that have always kept him confined. But now, Negro was locked up in a different kind of prison, a self-created prison called addiction. Being able to relate to his hardships on some level, I'd be willing to bet that he was probably at that stage where he kept himself pacified daily with broken promises of entering recovery and regaining control of his life. I'm sure there was probably many nights where he laid there and even thought about himself being relegated as a target, being green-lighted and marked for death by his so-called brothers in crime, by the same criminal organization that he had belonged to for his entire adult life. These were the extreme lows that he had hit, and reality, or those inner demons, they probably resonated whenever he thought about his circumstances. So Negro, he spent his entire days, day in and day out, hustling for his next fix, just to stay well, or as some say, just to remain normal. Whether he got it by scoring for others, burning people, panhandling, stealing, or by other means, he found ways to stay well. And his fear of being identified by an MA associate or someone from this underworld tapping in with people that were looking for him was always underscored by his addiction and his drug-induced lack of rationality. But whether he acknowledged that threat or not, it was still there. Maybe Negro assumed that being amongst those in the realm of this life and being amongst those at the bottom of the cesspool would afford him some measure of safety. That maybe he was at a depth where that type of threat didn't coexist. Who knows what he was thinking, but to be back out there in Long Beach, that close to the Mexican Mafia, was playing a dangerous game. As you guys know, word got around that Negro from Artesia was somewhere in that encampment. So this encampment and the people that lived there, sometimes they would walk around from tent to tent looking for something to get high on, something to eat or drink, or just visiting each other as if they were all part of some type of private community. So it wasn't out of the ordinary to see people walking around late at night, going from tent to tent, visiting each other. Sometimes in an effort to stay warm, you could go down there late at night and see people standing around bonfires. They take one of those big steel garbage cans, prop it up on rocks, fill it with wood, and then stand around the radiating heat, trying to get warm. It was a world that didn't function on the same hours as the rest of us. Now, keeping all this in mind kind of set the stage for anyone to walk into that encampment and get an easy drop on anyone that they might be looking for. And unfortunately for Negro, that's exactly what happened. On the night of January 10th, 2021, two individuals approached the encampment on foot. And apparently, through an extensive investigation, law enforcement was able to determine that one of them was identified as Andrew Reyna, boxer from Paramount. And here's the thing, a few weeks prior to Negro getting hit, Boxer was heard telling someone on a recorded phone call at USP Victorville that he promised he would take care of town southeast, a reference believed to be Negro's hometown in southeast LA County. And through the course of this investigation, law enforcement was also able to determine that Boxer was working under the Mexican Mafia and that he had an established contact that he was reporting to. So after crawling through a hole in one of the fence's perimeters, they began approaching several different tents, asking people if they know which tent Negro was in. Some of the other homeless people there didn't know who Negro was and couldn't help him, but others that did eventually pointed them to the right tent. At least 2 other homeless people in this encampment that talked to Boxer and his unidentified accomplice noticed that they were both wearing black nitrile gloves, the same gloves surgeons and mechanics use in the automotive industry. They're resistant to acids, caustics, chlorinated solvents, and other harsh chemicals. And they obviously wore these gloves to avoid from leaving behind trace evidence, such as DNA and fingerprints. It's also believed that wearing these gloves restricts the deposition of bodily fluids being left on firearms, and that gunpowder residue might not directly be deposited on somebody's hands due to the barrier of the gloves. At any rate, this caught the attention of at least 2 people at the homeless encampment. But at the time, nobody there had any reason to believe that Negro was in that kind of trouble. So minutes after they were positively pointed to the tent Negro was living in, gunshots were heard and muzzle flashes were seen in the area by Negro's tent. And just like that, the Mexican Mafia's reach had been extended to this homeless encampment in Long Beach, California, and had successfully taken out one of its high priority targets. Whether this was a message to some of the Mexican Mafia's other hermits, defectors, and deserters, or whether this was just taking advantage of an easy target that ended up being a sitting duck. For the M, this was a win-win and a perpetual victory that undoubtedly benefits the moral fabric of this criminal enterprise. It also reinforces the Mexican Mafia's ability to reach out and touch some of those who have dishonored or disrespected this organization, whether this came from a federal USP or a state prison in California. This was a directive that was sanctioned from hundreds and hundreds of miles away. Those that might not have been taking the threat of also being a target serious might be rethinking that threat and wondering if and when they might be going to Brazil next. I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys like this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. As always, I just want to thank those of you who continue to show your unwavering support and, of course, for continuing to stand with me. I might not get to answer every last one of the comments, but trust me, I see and read them all, and I make mental notes of what some of you are saying. The negativity is insignificant. The haters and the trolls only feel relevant when they're made to feel relevant. Anyways, you guys enjoy the rest of your week and keep pushing that positivity. Until the next one, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.